The Bob Murphy Show, episode 449.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today, apparently for the first time, we had been chatting before we started recording. I thought I'd had him on the show before, but apparently not. It's Daniel Kuehn. Now his name looks like it's Kuehn, but it's Kuehn. And he has been a long-time participant in the Murphy online experience, going way back to the free advice economics blog days, back when I would write long essays replete with screenshots of Excel files that I had used to construct counterexamples. And now you're lucky if you folks get a shift key when I tweet something. But in any event, Daniel's been around for a while, and I appreciate him because he is not by any stretch a libertarian or Austrian, but he does follow my stuff and is aware of our work and has written some things on it. And so let me go ahead and read his official bio here, and then I'll explain what we're talking about in today's episode. So Daniel Kuehn is a principal research associate at the Urban Institute's Work, Education, and Labor Division. His research at the Urban Institute focuses on apprenticeship and workforce development. In his free time, Daniel also researches and publishes on the history of economics, focusing on James Buchanan, Warren Nutter, and the Virginia School of Economics. He is interested in the interaction of race, racism, and economics, and that has led to his recent work on W.E.B. Dubois. So that's what Daniel and I are talking about. Is he had something published in the Journal of Political Economy, which is a prestigious journal for academic economists, and it intersects with the Austrian school, as we will explain shortly. So with that introduction, here is my discussion with Daniel Kuehn. Well, Daniel, welcome to the Bob Murphy Show.
Good to be here.
So we were just chit-chatting before I hit the go button here that I had thought you'd been on before, and you don't think you have. So I guess I was remembering that we've certainly met before. That's definitely the case. So besides all of our internet banter and lore, the reason you're here today, Daniel, is that you've got in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is a respectable publication to have under your belt, a forthcoming article, Retrospectives, W.E.B. Dubois, Harvard Economics and Marginalist Wage Theory. And just to tease people a bit, that there's a lot of overlap with Austrian economics in this paper. And that's why you told me about it a while ago. And I think I saw an early manuscript and gave you some thoughts on the parts dealing with Bohm-Bawerk. But be that as it may, take it away. What's going on in this paper?
Yeah. And so the Austrians aren't really central to the paper itself, but I was talking to you before we started. I think that's the direction that's really exciting for this to go in. And I think it's a side of Dubois, is how he pronounces it, that not many people know, and even Dubois scholars haven't delved into this. He was deeply knowledgeable about Austrian economics. This was in the 1890s when he was at Harvard, so it was Karl Menger, Bohm-Bawerk that were writing at that time. And I just came across a manuscript that he had written during his graduate studies at Harvard. It was called The Constructive Critique of Wage Theory. And I had known a little bit about his Harvard economics studies, and I knew that he was interested in marginalism. And then when I delved into this, got the copy from the Harvard archives, I was just shocked because he knew the Austrians backward and forward. He was quoting Menger and Bohm-Bawerk, and he knew a lot of classical economists. It's a 158-page manuscript. About 2/3 of it is literature review. He knows his economists well, and he's struggling with questions about how wages are determined that were really hot, cutting-edge questions at the time in the 1890s. So I think...
Can I stop you there?
Sure.
So before we get too deep into that, so that's great. So I can't help but note the irony that I think that your name is mispronounced, and I just mispronounced his name too. So there you go. But can you
And I'll mispronounce a couple of the Austrians' names, I'm sure. Before
Right. Like I do feel like I can, Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk. Can you, people know the name or whatever. So can you kind of explain just first, like, just to refresh people's memory as to like, what is he known for? And he's like is it fair to say he's a hero to the left, or is that an overstatement?
Certainly. I mean, yeah, I think a hero to the left. I think he's an American icon. So Dubois was the first Black American to get a PhD from Harvard. And he started his career as a scholar and an intellectual. He studied economics at Harvard, economics and history at the University of Berlin, and then came back to Harvard, and worked in sociology and history. Did a lot of work on the history of Black America, right? So Souls of Black Folks is his most famous book people are probably aware of. He did urban studies of Black workers in Philadelphia. Later in his life, famous history of Reconstruction. So he was a scholar at the beginning of his career. Around the turn of the century, he moved from, he was always interested in social reform and civil rights, but he increasingly moved into civil rights work. He was one of the founders of the NAACP and very active in the early 20th century with civil rights work in that period. He died I forget if it was the day before or the day of, I think it was the day of, the morning of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So he's often thought of as the initiator of a lot of the civil rights work, passing the torch to King and others in 63. He was in the 30s, he picked up Marxism, built Marxism into his worldview. So when you say he's the darling of the left, he certainly was a leftist himself. But he edited the Crisis magazine, the NAACP's magazine. So he was just everywhere for several decades. So I'm looking at the very early part of his life when he was at Harvard, when he was thinking about economics. But he touched a lot
And forgive
of
me, his PhD was in economics?
His PhD, he ultimately earned it in history.
Okay.
So he did study economics at the graduate level, which is the work I'm going to be looking at. And he studied economics at University of Berlin, but he got his PhD in history. But, the disciplinary boundaries of that time, of course, were fluid. He was doing a lot of philosophy as well with William James. He was doing everything.
Yeah. I mean, that was back when economists were expected to know history, for one thing. So, yeah. And then also, just for people to understand, you're Beck. Am I right in saying, like, are you a labor economist? Is that what you call yourself?
Yeah.
Okay.
Labor is my field. I work at the Urban Institute as my day job, doing work on job training there. But I do history of economics in my spare time.
Okay, great. So that's partly why, like, you're so qualified to be talking about, and you, or at least you understand the Austrian position on various things. So you're open-minded. Okay. So thanks again, just for remind people, because I know people know, they've heard of this guy, but like, who is he again? And so now that's why it's extra interesting for you to say, oh, and I've got this manuscript that he wrote up talking about all of these figures from the history of economic thought.
Yep.
Okay. So what do you want to, like, what you take it from here. Where do you want to take the story?
Going through kind of his whole career, the snapshots, one thing you notice is I didn't say anything about him contributing to high theory, right? He was active in the 40s and 50s. He wasn't working with Paul Samuelson at the time, right? He wasn't a theorist. He was known as an empiricist, and that came from Berlin. If some of your listeners that know more about Austrian economics might have heard of the Methodenstreit, and that was between the Austrian economist Karl Menger and economists at the University of Berlin, the historicist Gustav Schmoller primarily, and then other historicists at the University of Berlin. And in Berlin, which is where Du Bois went after Harvard, it was all about historical study. And it was all about empiricism and understanding legal and historical processes and trying to think about how economies are structured in different societies historically. There was no universal theory. There was no marginalism or any kind of universal theory governing economic action. You just had to understand the laws that they passed, the norms, the culture, and that sort of thing. So that's most of Du Bois's life. But the interesting thing is that's not how economics was done outside of Berlin in a lot of places. And particularly at Harvard, they're still interested in economic theory. They're starting to read the marginalists, read the Austrians. And so before he leaves for Berlin in 1891, he's getting a more neoclassical education than we normally associate with Du Bois. And so that's when he writes this paper. It's for an essay contest right before he ships out to Berlin. That fall, he ships out to Berlin, and he finishes this in the summer.
Okay, so the function of your paper is just to explore this. Like, is there a lot of work on this paper, or were you the first person to really dive into it?
I wasn't the first. You'll get it mentioned, and I think I cite 4 or 5 or 6 times it's kind of mentioned in Dubois' bibliographies, but it's always a passing reference. I don't think anything more than 2 or 3 sentences. And I think it's what often happens when historians look at the history of economics but don't really understand economics.
Mm-hmm.
They completely miss what's so significant about what he's doing here. And I know we haven't really gotten to what's significant about what he's doing here. We'll get there. So they'll say things like, oh, he read Marx in the 1890s. So we know Du Bois wasn't a Marxist until the 1930s, but he knew about it earlier in his career.
Right.
It's like, that's true, but that's not the point of this manuscript that he wrote. So I think I give it a fuller reading than has ever been done before. And I think because Du Bois is so associated with historicism and Marxism, it's also just fascinating that he was even interested in marginalism at this point in his career.
Okay. Yeah. So you've done an excellent job warming us up to understanding the significance of this, or why this is, interesting given, the normal take, and why you're the guy that, others looking at it, just, they wouldn't even know what they were looking at. Whereas you are equipped, your destiny has led you to this point. So now tell us, what did you find?
And I said, I'm a labor economist, and this is the first paper I've done on the history of labor economics. So it's been fun for that reason too. So when Du Bois gets to Harvard, his economics professors are big marginalists, right? You think information moves slowly at this period of time. Economics isn't professionalized. So Menger and the marginalists kind of move slowly. So when you get to Harvard, he takes a class with Frank Taussig, who's a famous American economist, well-known opponent of tariffs. And Frank Taussig's classes are still teaching classical economists like Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. And so it's pre-marginal revolution. So just to remind readers, the classical economists didn't have, they had a sense of supply and demand, but they didn't have the utility functions that you would have learned in intermediate micro, right? That you maximize your utility subject to a budget constraint. You make decisions on the margin, and you set marginal benefits equal to marginal costs, and that's how you get the equilibrium. So anybody that's been through an economics class, that should be ringing some bells, right? In 1890, that was around, but it wasn't necessarily dominant, especially in American universities. And so what the wage theory that Du Bois learned when he got to Harvard was what's called the wages fund theory. And that started with a classical economist and was carried through John Stuart Mill. And the wages fund theory basically said you have a capital stock, you have all the wealth that exists in the world at a point in time. You've got to subtract the cost of raw materials off of that. You got to subtract profit off of that. And then whatever's left is left to pay wages. And so you get wage rates by dividing the capital stock by the number of workers. So no supply and demand, right? No marginal calculus there. And you might have heard of the iron law of wages, and this is where it comes from. If the capital stock is fixed, then the more people you have, the lower the wages are, because you've got to spread out the capital stock over more workers, right? And so there wasn't really a prospect for workers to agitate for higher wages. That more or less wages fund theory is built into the wage theory of all the classical economists in some way. That's why, like, Malthus and population theory was so important, because population was key input into the level of wages in a society, right? If you had a fast growing population, it would depress prices. That's what they felt was a really important factor back then. So Taussig taught this. Taussig understood that it was limited though, and he promoted what he called an elastic wages fund theory.
Can I stop you, Daniel? Let me just make sure people are getting, is this one way of looking at it, that you just picture at a moment in time, the workers, yes, they get paid money, but then they go and they use the money to go buy stuff. And so because production takes time, in terms of like right now today, what all the workers are eating, like that had to have been harvested, and it exists right now, like at some snapshot in time. There's like all this, we'll call it a fund, right? And so, I don't care. It does not matter social justice or whatever. Like people can't eat more tuna fish than exists right now. That's physically impossible. And you know, if this guy over here is going to have more, well, then somebody has to have less because there's only so much right now at this moment in time. That's the fund out of which wages are paid in real terms.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so the question is, and that on its own isn't ridiculous, right? Of course, we have to be paid out of some quantity of money, right? But the question is, how does that change over time? How dynamic is it? And how are those values set? And Taussig thought there was a realism to the wages fund theory that he appreciated. But he read a lot of the Austrians, and especially Bohm-Bawerk. He said that Bohm-Bawerk was the only economist who's ever rivaled Ricardo as a theorist. So he had a ton of respect for Bohm-Bawerk. And so he recognized that profit isn't fixed. Value of raw materials aren't fixed, right? That these are set based on their opportunity costs and the marginal value of a product. So he had an elastic wages fund theory. He thought the basic setup was okay. But because production happened over time and because these values could change, the wages fund itself was a dynamic quantity, right? Mm-hmm. And then and workers could bargain for more of it. Profits aren't fixed. You know, capitalists could get fewer profits, right? So he liked the framework and he wanted to build on that framework, and that was what he taught. He taught Dubois. And Dubois doesn't really talk about wages fund theory much in this constructive critique, but he's really interested in wage theory. And he understands that it's an open problem, right? Everybody is talking about factor prices, and factor prices are just the price of inputs to production. How much does labor cost? That's your wage. How much does rent and capital cost? That's your rate of interest, right? And rent on land, right? So how these prices are set was an open problem, because in the marginal revolution in the 1870s, they had primarily focused on consumption goods, right? When you learn marginal utility, you're talking about consumption. That's kind of how we teach it. We start there. And so it was a slow process to apply that to factor prices, and they hadn't quite gotten there yet. But there was a lot of people discussing how factor prices are determined. And so that's what he's exploring in the paper.
Okay, great. Because even like just in the standard Austrian story, right, like Menger lays out really, like you're saying, like apples trading for oranges kind of thing. And then it's only later, like with, I think probably Wieser is the one that they attribute to the most in terms of spelling out like the marginal analysis applied to factor prices. You know, it's kind of all implicit, but in terms of just really walking through the logic of it and saying, how is it that the unit services of a tractor get priced, you know, you can't just appeal to marginal utility because, you know, a tractor doesn't directly give you utility the way an apple pie does. So,
and there's also features of these markets that are just different, right? Like tractors, capital goods are durable. So that makes the pricing a little different. You've got to think about the time structure. Labor is human beings. So people aren't inclined to think about those like they do apples and oranges. And it's one of the really tough things about history of economics, just in general, I think. You look back on it and it feels really obvious how marginalism would apply to factor prices. But it took smart people 20 or 30 years really to nail that down. Yeah. Also,
too, like I remember it was Bohm-Bawerk's work, something like Principles of Economic Value or something. I'm botching it was the English translation of the title. And just going through it and how careful he had to go through just simple things like, like if, you say, oh, well, how much do you value this unit of something? And there's like the direct appeal to you, but also like, if you know that, oh, this is valued by others, well, then how does that affect your own valuation? Just simple little things like that. But that's kind of a tricky thing to handle from first principles. Yeah. If you're the first person in history writing this out, like, you know what I mean? And so like, we just kind of take it, well, yeah, I'm sure. But like anyway, I'm just saying when I was reading through that, I was like, no one ever taught me this. Like I guess, but here he had to kind of lay it out because this was like, they're trying to convince people this is a good way to think about value and price. So, and it's the vehicle for teaching it too, right? And I'm going to bash the Austrians a little here, but so Austrians do the original Austrians, right? Do marginalism with ranked values, right? And they don't have a production function or a utility function. Again, like you probably learned,
in economics that you can just do calculus on easily, right? They have this ranking, and you had to think about relative values of different people's rankings, and like explaining that in a text. Yeah, it's clunky, and you've got to walk every step through it. And it's just, I think there's been over time, people have perfected it, just how we explain it too, right? And what's the most intuitive way. And calculus has won out for better or worse, the Austrian way. Austrians were founders of marginalism, but their way of talking about it hasn't really won out the battle of history.
Yes. I mean, I certainly agree with that. And just, I know not like we're arguing or something, but the flip side is the calculus just kind of assumes stuff away that when you go and see the original exposition, oh yeah, there's some like almost philosophical issues going on here that never even occurred to me. So
and how you think about value, and also just the assumptions that you make so that you can do the calculus, right? These functions don't come well behaved. You kind of pretend they're well behaved.
Even the terms like in Bohm-Bawerk Street, like utility and value and price were three separate things. Whereas I was like, what's the difference between utility and value? Like before I read him, I had been kind of just like, it's not interchangeable, and they're not interchangeable in at least the English translation of his stuff. Okay, so this is great, and yeah, not especially as you're saying, it's not surprising that when Dubois, is that how you say it? Yes, was
you
studying,
want to make it fancier than it actually is. Yeah. It's Dubois. Yeah,
it's like it's people want to say Walras, but my understanding is Walras. Like I even asked some guy from France, and that's what he said. So anyway, that's what I'm going with. That it's not surprising then that in terms of factor pricing and, you know, the price of labor hours, that the marginal revolution was still in its infancy and percolating into that. If it's around like what did you say, 1891? Did you say
1891? Yep.
Okay, so great. Okay, so and then in the title of his paper is what? Because you said it a minute ago, but I want to make sure. Constructive critique.
A constructive critique of wage theory. Yeah.
Okay. So. What is he? Where do you want to take the story?
Sure. Well, yeah, let's just work through the constructive critique. And the first 2/3 of it is, like I said, it's literature review. And he hits the people you would expect. John Bates Clark is a major name in factor pricing. Alfred Marshall. He goes back, of course, to Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, all the big names. But the section he spends the longest on is the Austrian school. And he treats Jevons separately from the Austrians. I don't think Walras is in there because I don't think he talked at all about workers and labor. But the longest section in this literature review is the Austrians. And he covers a little of Menger and a lot of Bohm-Bawerk. And the reason why it's so long is, unlike the others, he really starts at square one with value theory and explaining value rankings and sacrifices that you make when you compare different wants, right, that are conflicting wants, and you've got to give one up to achieve the other. And so the value of the good that you give up, right, the opportunity cost of what it is that you're trying to obtain is how much you value it, right, in the Mengerian rankings. So he builds up Austrian value theory from square one. And then he starts to talk about factor prices, Bohm-Bawerk on interest and on wages. So you can kind of see, working through the literature review, he likes these guys and he's familiar with these guys. He's one of the things I've found interesting is he cites them, publications from them in English language journals. He's not citing the German. He does speak German. He's about to go off to Berlin. So he does speak German, but he's a student. He's a little uncomfortable with it. He cites it in the English, which is interesting. And he gets through all of these theorists. And then in the last third of the manuscript, he says, I'm going to digest this and propose my own theory. And he's a very generous reader. He doesn't just say, oh, Ricardo was a dummy for the wages fund theory. We can forget about him. He has this perspective that everybody's got their hand on the elephant, and nobody has the complete picture yet. Which is true. Wieser hadn't, maybe he had just went, and you helped me a lot with Wieser, but was it, I think it was like 1889, he had some contributions, but not even all of the Austrians' work on it, and John Bates Clark's book had been published yet. So it's reasonable that everybody had their hand on the elephant. Everybody has something important to contribute. And he says, well, I'm going to present my theory. And he starts again with Menger and with value rankings. And he says that I think the Austrians are the closest to it, and I'm going to build up from that. And I've got this really great image that I'm including in the article. So I'll try to share that to show. Let me share screen on this. Okay, so this is the one screenshot from the manuscript that I included in my article, and of course you can see this is 158 pages of handwriting, so it's slower slogging through it than printed text. And what he has here,
his whole manuscript is longhand.
Yeah,
is that normal back then? Didn't they have typewriters? At Harvard?
I guess they did, but like as a student, would you access it?
Okay,
I don't know how.
That's amazing to me.
Yeah.
The full professors have secretaries that type the stuff up, but geez, yeah. Yep. Okay.
And you can see where he's getting tired, and it gets a little scribble here, and then he comes back refreshed. Okay. So this is page 144 of this 158-page manuscript. So deep into his theory now. He's built up from Menger and ranked values. And so he has a system where he presents the laborer's ranked values, the capitalist's ranked values, and the consumer's ranked values. So on the upper right hand, we've got these lines D, E, F, G. Those are your 4 laborers. The C line in the upper left is the capitalist. And then at the bottom, L, P, Q, R, S, T are the consumers. And so it goes through all of them. There's lots of different ranked values for each of them. He's got how much workers would have to work if they produced an autarky. So if they were not exchanging their labor with capitalists and cooperating with capitalists to create goods, so they'd have to work 20 hours to make the same product that it would take 10 hours to work for a capitalist, right? So there's efficiencies in division of labor. And then the wage rate is in W, and then what the goods that the worker wants that they'll exchange the wages for is Y, right? So they value Y over the value of their wages W, so they're willing to exchange their wages for the goods Y that they want. So that's the ranking there. And then it connects each of the value rankings for the laborer, the capitalist, and the consumers together. So you'll see that there's this dashed line between the wages W and $6 an hour that the capitalists pay. Okay. And then the capitalists sell their goods to the consumers, and the consumers they have all different values, right, for the relative sacrifice that they'd be willing to make for the consumer goods. So he sets up this system of ranked values that each of the members of the labor exchange have, and he represents the wage rate as being in these rankings in the time that they have to sacrifice relative to the time that they have to sacrifice to earn that wage rate. So the wage is ranked higher than the 10 hours that they have to sacrifice to earn it, right? He has this Mengerian setup here. Okay. So that on its own doesn't tell you how the wage rate is calculated, right? But he's using Menger to kind of build this up, which is interesting. Okay. So, and he recognizes that he's got the $6 per hour wage, but he doesn't show how it's calculated. So he then asks, well, how does the wage determine in the first place that are in these relative rankings for the capitalists and for the workers, right? And he comes up, he knows he has to talk about labor demand and labor supply, and he has a marginalist.
Can I stop you for a second? Are you right now? Is this his own theory that comes in the last part of the paper, or he's just recapitulating what the Austrian said?
This is his own theory. So obviously he's using Menger's setup.
Okay, that's what I want to clarify. Yeah.
Yeah. So the value rankings are from Menger. I don't think, and you're the expert here. So I was very careful not to say what he was first on. I don't think, these ideas are percolating. I'm not aware of any Austrian that has like set it up like this and kind of tackled the problem this way. But absolutely he's taken the tools of the Austrians to do it. And this is his theory that he's purporting. Yeah.
Folks, let's take a break from the action for this important announcement. If you care about your liberty and your financial freedom, you need to hear this. From October 10th through 12th, Mikkel Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show, who's been a guest on this program, is bringing together top experts from around the world for the Expat Money Online Summit, and it's completely free to attend. You'll learn how to legally protect your wealth, secure second residencies and citizenships, reduce your tax burden, and own property abroad, all to safeguard your freedom. This year's focus is Latin America, where opportunity is booming. Argentina is shifting to free markets. And as an aside, word on the street is that Milei recently told his top lieutenants that they should go read my booklet, Chaos Theory. True story. That really happened. El Salvador is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and Panama and Paraguay are offering simple residency programs. A Plan B is no longer optional. It's essential. So reserve your free ticket at expatmoneysummit.com. That's EXPAT moneysummit.com. expatmoneysummit.com for your free ticket. Do it today. Let's get back to the show now. Okay, before you continue with this, can I just ask, so he summarized, like you said, he respected Bohm-Bawerk, and that wouldn't be surprising since you said Taussig, also did, his professor there. When he's going through and just kind of summarizing the literature, does he say, and forgive me, because I know I read an earlier version of your manuscript, but I haven't read it carefully again as I should have, like yesterday, but I didn't. Does he say, like, here's Bohm-Bawerk's theory? I know he had some kind of throwaway line about, I'm not confident in how I just summarized it, but this is the best I can. Doesn't he say something like that?
Yep. That was back in the literature review. So He quotes this big block quote from Bohm-Bawerk, and he paraphrases it. And I thought that was funny because Dubois is known for being a very confident guy, self-confident guy,
right?
For good reason, right? He was a genius, but he is not. He's not bashful about it. And he kind of says that about Bohm-Bawerk, that this is complicated and I might have messed it up. Yeah.
Okay. So where I'm going with this long lead up setup is, does he say, okay, now that I've summarized his theory, the weaknesses of the Bohm-Bawerkian approach are blah, blah, blah. And that's why now I'm going to give something that, takes the tools of what was good with the Austrians, but they missed the boat on this? Or does he just think he's like filling in details that they overlooked?
I think both. And he fills in the details first, like he takes what he thinks is the next step first. And then he does have an interesting criticism of where they're wrong. So I might fill in the details first and then come back to that.
Okay, great. I need to know, but also I want the listeners to understand, like, what are we doing here? And then where are we going with it? Got it.
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
Go ahead. This is great.
Okay, so he had that setup. He has the Mengerian setup. He knows everybody has ranked values. He knows they trade for each other, assuming the value of the trade is higher than the alternative. But then where does that 6-hour wage that he's got up on that figure come from? So he knows he has to define that as well. And it's nice just to work through. He knows how he has to build the theory to make it plausible. And so he starts with labor demand. Why would a capitalist demand labor? And he said there are two factors that the capitalist considers. First, the value of the capitalist wants. They want these profits because he has this list, carriages and all kinds of like 1890s things that capitalists don't want anymore. But like capitalists want something out of it. And then he also, the capitalist has to consider, he says, the sacrifice of gratification, which will be made for it by the consumer. So the consumers are also making this marginal calculus of what sacrifice they'll make for the good that labor is producing. So what's the opportunity cost of the good that they're purchasing? And that those two together determine how much labor the capitalist will demand at each price. So this gets into a little bit more detailed marginalist theory, but this is basically a theory of what we call the marginal revenue product of labor. That it's not just how much labor another unit of labor produces, but what's the marginal revenue of that in the market based on the demand curves for the good that labor is producing. Okay. So you've got your marginalist demand curve now, your labor demand curve. And then he moves to the labor supply curve, and he has a marginalist explanation for that too. So he says that the relative return of the laborers and the employer will depend on the sacrifice they're willing to undergo to satisfy their wants. If the wages are not advanced, i.e., if sacrifice of labor is greater, then by definition, the value of his wants is greater. It will call for more sacrifice on the part of the employer to fulfill it. So he has a marginalist theory of labor supply. And he says another equilibrium will thus be reached, giving the laborer a larger share. And so the intersection of labor supply and labor demand, he's got a marginalist explanation of both, will give you that $6 or whatever it is, right? not as clean as you read in your economics textbooks today, and that's part of why I find it difficult to say he got to an idea first, because these ideas are still very rough in Dubois, right?
Right.
But he does work through the labor demand problem and use a marginal utility explanation, and a labor supply problem and use a marginal utility explanation for that.
Yeah, in general, history of history of economics, that's what you and I know probably best. But in general, like to say, oh, who was the first person that said such? It's like you can always find somebody earlier who said something kind of like that, just not as crisply as this person said, that we just attribute like, so and so in this year discovered this concept, and like, no, he didn't. So this question you had about where did the Austrians go wrong in his opinion is another great example of this, because he actually thought they didn't include opportunity costs, which of course is going to be developed later than 1891 by Wieser, right? But he says at the time that and let me find the exact quote as well, because he has a great line for this. Okay, so he says, according to the Austrian theory, value depends on the indispensableness of a certain thing to satisfy a certain want, i.e. its final utility. The question naturally arises, why is this thing indispensable? It is answered by the Austrians because of its scarcity. But what does mere scarcity have to do with wants? If air exists by the worldful, it is just as indispensable that I should have a breath as it is if there is only 1 cubic foot in creation. Here we come upon the weakness of the whole theory, which is noticeable in the treatment of value in its connection with the cost of production. So he's saying that value itself doesn't just depend on how much value you place on it relative to the next good. I have that backward. It doesn't just depend on scarcity of the good. So it's not just how much air there is. Air is just as valuable to you. The last breath of air is just as valuable to you, whether there's a whirlpool or whether there's 1 cubic foot, right? But it's the sacrifice that you make by giving it up. Giving up a breath of air is going to be fatal, right? No matter how much air there is out there. So he is talking about the sacrifice costs, these opportunity costs of giving up a good, rather than just kind of a quantity approach to marginal utility. So I think this, Wieser develops this in more detail, opportunity costs, as that's developed. And I'm not sure, this is another area where I'm not sure if that critique is quite fair to Mengler and Bohm-Bawerk. I don't know them well enough to know if in 1891, opportunity costs have been built into Austrian theory yet in any detail, but that's the critique that he makes. Yeah, I mean, if you're putting a gun to my head and ask you right now, I would say it's not fair, because I just double checking. It wasn't like I was doing text or something, but I was just looking at, so like standard, like in the history of economic thought online encyclopedia, if you type in like opportunity cost, it'll say, there were early precursors in, I think, von Theunen and even John Stuart Mill, but the definitive thing is like Wieser, I think it's like 1884 and 1889. And so, I for sure, Bohm-Bawerk in like, I guess volume 3 of his Capital Interest clearly would have had, that stuff in there. So, but it is true. Like in Bohm-Bawerk, I don't know that. I mean, and again, if he's writing it in German, it's tricky, right, to say like when did he use? But yeah, I don't think that they use the term opportunity cost in the early stuff. But help me out. Is it even there though? Is he saying that they said something wrong, or just that it was you get the distinction? Yeah.
Well, maybe not. What do you mean? What is the distinction?
That
he's
saying I guess he's saying, according to the Austrians, all you need to determine equilibrium prices is scarcity, and that's clearly false because of blah blah blah. So if that's what he's saying, then yes, he would be accusing them of being wrong. But I would just say he's incorrect in what he thought their position was.
Yeah. I think what's interesting when you read these guys is like, so let's stipulate that he was wrong and he didn't know. I think it's amazing that he like works through this on his own.
Right.
And we don't think of him as like thinking about these problems or reading these people. So like, forget if he was the first, like who cares if he has
Right.
priority on these issues. It's amazing to see people you don't expect like working through these problems and being a part of these discourses. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, right. I should be clear in case my tone was. I was fascinated by your paper, and I like that is impressive, especially like you say, like this guy that we associate with like the civil rights movement or something, and this icon of Black America. That when he went to Harvard and went through it, he was just going through this and just sort of like, here, let me just bang this thing out before I get on a boat and go across the ocean. That's again, even if it were and. Maybe too, if you're saying like he was only reading the English stuff, I mean, I don't know off the top of my head, had Beezer's stuff been translated yet? I don't know. So anyway, that's,
I should go back. I don't know if he covers Beezer in the Austrian section, because he's covering it as like the Austrian theory, not individuals. So I should check that. And that's the other thing I wanted to emphasize, like to listeners that are interested in the Austrian school. I only touch on Austrians briefly in my paper because there's Tausig and there's lots of other things going on. I think there's a really interesting paper just on Dubois and what he thought of the Austrians, because I do only kind of breeze over it.
Okay. Just not to beat a dead horse, but again, I would need to go in carefully and just see exactly and stop and ponder what is Dubois saying they said and blah, blah, blah. But just as a first cut, or I guess it's the second cut at this point, because I already answered you before, is like one way to, like if you're teaching the standard history of economic thought and then you get to like the Marshallian scissors synthesis kind of thing, and it's like, they'd emphasize the utility, demand side, but also the real cost of production side. And then what you can do as a foil, if you're teaching it from an Austrian perspective, is to say, now, Austrians think that both sides are ultimately all due to, marginal utility theory. Like even the supply curve itself is all based on opportunity cost. It's not that nature actually, has some list of constraints or something. And you know what I mean? So that's what I'm just saying. Like if he's saying that, the Austrians thought it was all scarcity and didn't realize that really it was opportunity cost and like valuation and was involved. It's just, would strike me as being implausible.
Yeah. And history of economics is full of these, right? Like Keynes and Say's law, right? It's a total straw man, but it's part of what they use to build up their argument. I think it's important to think about why they're saying that and why they're using it and what role it plays in their text. Yeah.
And just to be nerdy about this, for what it's worth, the reason that stuck with me when I read your thing about the him like having in a footnote or something saying, I have thus summarized or paraphrased Bohm-Bawerk's theory, but I am not confident that I did it justice, or whatever his exact wording was. Yeah. The reason I thought that was funny is because when I read his paraphrase, at first I went, that's not Bohm-Bawerk's theory. What is he talking about? But then when I was thinking about it, I was like, I could see why he would say that, because it was, for the listeners, it was something like, Dubois said something like, according to Bohm-Bawerk, this is a paraphrase, folks, that the wages are determined because of the amount of present goods for future goods that people are paying, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what is he talking about? What? And then I realized what he was getting at. That so the basic story that Bohm-Bawerk says is, and it's funny, it's ironic because he uses this to try to knock down the Marxist exploitation theory. So like in this, standard Marxist approach, the workers produce a pile of stuff, but they only get paid a fraction of that because the capitalists skim the profit off the top. And so that's like the fundamental sense in which the workers are not being paid the full value of their product. How could they be? Because if they were, there's nothing left for the capital, right? That's like a way of looking at it. And so Bohm-Bawerk tried to flip that. And he said, no, as long as there's competition, blah, 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 workers, of course, get paid the full value of their product. But you have to remember the time element, that if you're a worker right now and you chop down some trees or something that are going to be used to build a house that's not going to be sold for a year, what you're doing is you're contributing to a future house. And a future house doesn't have the same value as a present house. And so, of course, you wouldn't be paid. So anyway, he just uses that and is basically, and that, it kind of ties in with the old classical subsistence fund theory where the capitalists are paying the workers with present goods in exchange for stuff that won't ripen into present goods until the future. Yeah. And so because of that time discount, that's why it seems like the workers aren't getting paid the full value anyway.
And that bringing it back to Tausig, who maybe I skipped over. What Tausig loved about Bohm-Bawerk, that he provided this more flexible view of how workers were paid than just out of the static fund that existed at the time. Yeah.
So anyway, I'm just saying that, once I walked through that and I was like, oh, that's what Dubois is trying to say, or Dubois, sorry, is trying to say. But anyway, that was okay. So are we missing anything important, or have you given enough of an infomercial and people should read your paper?
I think that's good. I mean, just to say that this was sort of a public good. The PDF is available on Harvard's website now. It wasn't previously, but they do this thing where if you pay them to digitize it, they'll post it up for everybody. So I just think there's more work to do in there if you're interested in the Austrian school, because he writes a lot about the Austrian school that I didn't get into. So I would just emphasize that. There's a lot more to learn and explore on him.
Did you pay them to digitize it, or somebody else did?
No, I did.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, just whatever.
Did?
Yeah. Just the, however much time they stood in front of the copier, but now it's posted. So it's all up online.
I mean, amongst other things now, your contributions to humanity include that.
I'm a philanthropist, Bob. Yeah.
Okay, well, folks, my guest has been Daniel Kuehn, even though it should be pronounced Kuehn. And he's been here telling us about his forthcoming paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives on Dubois and marginalist theory and its relevance to the Austrian. So thanks, Daniel, for your time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.